You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
All right, so welcome everybody. This is the MCC's GeoPod podcast. I am your host, Szóta Sütkei, and with me today, Hanga Horvath-Santha, who is an assistant lecturer of the Károly Gáspár University of the Reformed Church and a researcher at the MCC Geopolitical Center. Hanga, thank you so much for this discussion.
Thank you for the invitation.
If I know correctly, you lived in Sweden, and today's topic will be Sweden. Can you tell me how long did you stay in Sweden?
I lived there for approximately 25 years, plus or minus 2 or 3 years.
So it was a long time, and first I want to ask you about your experience in Sweden. We know that Sweden underwent a huge social change. The social landscape changed a lot. And can you tell me about your experience? What did you see about this?
Well, on one hand, I have to underline already in the beginning that me and my family also arrived as migrants in the political turbulence in Transylvania at the end of the 80s. So basically, we also received refugee protection as political refugees coming from Transylvania. So I have really first-hand experience with the very liberal and kind and generous policies on the area of immigration when it comes to Sweden. But during my time in Sweden, I could really witness with almost my own eyes how the landscape changed. We were obviously not the first refugees to receive protection status in Sweden, but there were many persons coming from a variety of backgrounds, both within Europe. It's enough only to think about, for instance, the Balkans in the beginning of the 90s. But it was later, around the 90s, that this type of country of origin started to change, because then Sweden would receive mainly refugees coming from third countries, including, for instance, Iraq, Iran. Iran already started after 79, after the revolution, but from North Africa and several countries of the Middle East, and also, of course, Somalia as one of the main countries of origin. And this was really when I wouldn't say that the whole landscape, but the problems that would follow in the steps of immigration would become visible. Because many of the persons who would be granted refugee protection, they came from countries who had a very different culture, who had a very different religion, who had a very different view on how society would function, who would govern society, what norms would be the ones that persons should live their lives accordingly to, whether this be the laws of the state or whether these be the laws of the religion in particular. Plus, many persons came from countries that were almost completely illiterate. And coming from this background and entering a very liberal democracy based on a very high amount of information and literacy skills, and obviously digital skills, were all factors that would have a very large impact on the success of integration.
And this integration problem that led to the higher number of crime, what do you think this is mainly the problem of the people who immigrated Sweden, their different culture, or is this more to blame the Swedish government who couldn't handle this situation?
Well, I believe that the intent of the Swedish government and the Swedish immigration policies has always been very kind and very good, and a bit naive, in a sense that it's not sufficient to grant large number of persons refugee protection if you do not have the necessary means to actually integrate all these persons. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the persons who were granted refugee status, they came from war-torn areas, probably had several war traumas, and it doesn't make any sense to commence already with, for instance, language courses, but first you have to make sure that these persons receive psychological support. They receive some sort of therapy to help them to get over the different traumas regarding their lives and their families and things that happened to them on the way to Sweden. And of course, considering the very large numbers, in some years, approximately 90,000 or 100,000, or I think the record years were the years of obviously the migrant crisis hitting the entire Europe in 2015 and 2016, where more than 160,000 persons entered Sweden, which is basically a middle-sized city. And I don't believe that any country possesses all the necessary means in terms of funding and in terms of expertise to actually have persons on the ground, making sure that these persons receive all necessary help to then eventually start learning the language and starting to learn how Swedish society functions. So on one hand, yes, there was a very large political will to receive large numbers, but the handling of these very large persons or the large numbers on the ground did not quite correlate. And like you mentioned, yes, we see many of the results of these bad integration policies today in form of gang-related violence, extremists growing, the growth of jihadist milieus in Sweden, and of course disintegration, which may be either a voluntary segregation, meaning that immigrants are in many cases likely to move to live together with persons coming from the same country, or an involuntary, meaning that maybe they would like to move away from that particular low-income immigrant majority suburb, but they don't have the means and they don't have any chance to do so. So they're basically stuck in that segregation.
And you mentioned the help of these immigrants who arrive in Sweden, but well, this was some time ago, and in Sweden, I'm sure that there are some generations of the children of immigrants who are already born there and know the language. But as to my knowledge, there's some problem with the second or even third generation immigrants in Sweden. So can the foremost help of these immigrants with psychological help prevent these generational problems, or is this more like an educational system kind of problem, or what do you think about this?
Well, I think that we should separate these two issues. On one hand, when I mentioned the psychological help, I was specifically referring to the refugees who came from war-torn countries, who came from, for instance, many of the persons coming from Syria, or many of the persons fleeing from the Shah in Iran at the end of the 70s. Many of the persons fleeing from Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So basically people who have experiences from war, they are the ones who should receive this type of help. When it comes to the second and third generation immigrants, that is a completely different chapter. And I would say that these problems, when it comes to especially the second and third generation of Muslim youth, they are not typical for Sweden, but they are rather typical for the entire Western Europe. I see the same issues among the second and third generation immigrants of Muslim parents or Muslim immigrants in France, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and so on and so forth. And this is a really interesting category. This is also my research topic for my PhD studies. That the question is why this group is so vulnerable when it comes to radicalization and recruitment by jihadist organizations, such as, for instance, Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, who have particularly been targeting this vulnerable group. And the way I see it is that the members of this delimited group, they are sort of stuck in a limbo between two worlds. On one hand, they have the world of their parents. They may speak or may not speak the language of the parents. and maybe they have not even been in their country of origin, but they know that it exists and they know that this is part of their identity, but maybe they are not able to fully embrace it. On the other hand, there is obviously the culture and the religion or non-religion of the host society, the language of the host society, that may have very different values on how to live, who you can engage with, who you can marry, what type of activities you can participate in as a girl, for instance. And I see that many members of many persons belonging to the second and third generation, they are not able to fully find the balance between these two worlds. And honestly, I don't see that there are any measures from the host societies helping these youngsters to cope with both identities. Identity is, in psychological research, something that is very, very important to have a stable life, to have a stable existence. And today, of course, identity can be many things, many different components. But there has to be some sort of balance between these different components for the person to feel stable. And I see that this is the main problem, that there is really no identity, or that there is no good forces in the society teaching these youngsters that actually they can be both if they want to. They can be, for instance, Somalis living in a liberal and secular country, or they can be Swedish if they, for instance, visit their relatives in Mogadishu. So there are no protocols, or there are no guidebooks, and I don't see that there are any positive, or not too many positive forces who would actually teach these kids how to embrace maybe the best of all worlds.
So the solution for this dual identity or this identity crisis could be education or social work, or what's the responsibility of the state here?
Well, in my experience, there are some civil society organizations who work with these issues, who are from a migrant origin themselves, who can really understand the problem that these youngsters face in their old days. I have seen, for instance, the case of where imams have been a part of the solution, in the case of where the imams themselves have lived in the specific country for maybe a decade or more decades. But I have also seen many cases where the imams have been actually a really big part of the problem, since in many cases we know that the imams are, I'm sorry for the ugly word, but they are imported. They are sent by the funding state. For instance, Saudi Arabia in many cases, and of course an imam coming from Saudi Arabia entering a liberal and secular country like Sweden may not be familiar with the type of problems that a second or third generation immigrant may face, and hence may not be the best advisor in questions regarding how to live one's life. So yes, I see that on one hand there are many civil organizations who try to help, but I do lack a recognition from the state or the municipality to realize that this actually is a problem. And of course, one solution would be to try to minimize the volumes of immigrants coming from the very same background that continue to provide a supply to these already existing segregated suburbs. And first deal with those who are already in the country that we are talking about, and make sure that we first can mitigate the problems before maybe 90 or 100,000 new ones arrive. Because these are the statistics that we see still every year.
And well, this problem seemingly bothers the Swedish residents, the population as well, because we can see that in September there was a general election when, after a long time of left-wing government, the right-wing parties had won. So this could this be the new era for migration policy and the social policy of Sweden?
Maybe yes, and maybe not. But what one has to understand about Swedish society and Swedish culture is that it's very, very consensus-based. And this is something that is prevalent on a lot of different levels. We see it on the political level, we see it on the societal level, We see it on the professional level, working together. It's a really, really strongly consensus-oriented culture. And immigration has been a big taboo for many years. There is even a really interesting PhD dissertation on the topic that is maybe 10 or 15 years old, but it examines exactly why this culture of political correctness could develop in Sweden. And the author's theory is that the Social Democrats, who governed for around 80 years during the past century, the way they shaped the term multiculturalism is in a way that it cannot be criticized by anyone or by anything, or even the smallest, although legitimate criticism of this term multiculturalism or the phenomenon is considered to be racist and xenophobic, and hence is something that would not be taken into the general debate. And in this dissertation, really interestingly, the author derives how the managing of this term multiculturalism has actually led to the fact that nobody dares to talk about taboos and really big issues that are connected to migration. Because reading the newspapers, both the Swedish as well as the international newspapers, is almost filled daily with news on gang-related violence, on other types of violence and crime related to immigration and the segregation and the disintegration. So for many, many years, the problems have been visible, but the mainstream parties have completely neglected to talk about this issue. And I think that the results from this year's general election is a really clear illustration of this. Now one could really bluntly summarize it with the fact that reality has caught up with all the political parties as well as with the voters. And I'm really curious to see whether there actually will be de facto changes when it comes to immigration policies. Because when the right-wing parties were governing 12 years ago and 16 years ago, it was the moderate party who had the migration minister, who at one occasion said something like, we need to look over the volumes of irregular migrants entering Sweden, which was really, really, it was a very sensitive topic, obviously, but it was a very careful statement. And even considering how careful this statement was, there was massive criticism targeting this minister from a variety of directions. So actually the right-wing parties, of course, saw these problems already 12 or 16 years ago, but they were themselves then again part of the problem by not doing anything. So that was why I'm wondering why now when the same party is the party that gives the prime minister, whether they will actually do anything concrete to mitigate the situation.
Well, we will see about it, because I think the moderate party and the Swedish Democrat Party, the one of the main principles of their campaign was the tougher stance on migration. So it wasn't really a taboo in this campaign season.
Well, not anymore. Not anymore. But now was the first time that these parties were actually daring to talk about it. Obviously, the Sweden Democrats, they have been talking about the flaws and the failures of Swedish migration policy for many, many years. Already before 2010, that was the first general election to the Swedish parliament, the Riksdag, when they entered for the first time. And already then their flagship was basically to restructure migration policy completely. Now the situation is still quite sensitive, which we will also see, I think, reflected in the new government. And the fact that despite the Sweden Democrats being the largest opposition party and the second largest political party of all the parties, they will not have any positions in the government because cooperation with them still counts as something highly sensitive and a bit of a taboo. But of course, since they are the biggest party on the right-wing side, obviously they need the political influence that would illustrate this type of largeness that they received during the past elections. So what we see now is that they get important and influential positions, such as, for instance, chairing the Committee for Justice Affairs in the Swedish Riksdag. There are some rumors about that one of the high-ranking party members of the Sweden Democrats will lead the Swedish delegation to the OSCE. And also the deputy speaker of the Swedish Riksdag comes from this very party. So yes, they have, and they will probably get many influential positions, but it is not that likely that they will get any ministerial posts.
And well, as of today, the 12th of October, there is still not an agreement between the right-wing parties to form the coalition, but for a moment, let's suppose that this coalition comes into life, and what this would mean to the politics of the Nordic region and maybe to Europe, because you've mentioned all the Western countries who fight with the same problems as Sweden did or does right now. Could this change start to catch up in Western countries as well?
Well, when it comes to the level of professionals, I already saw that this cooperation regarding issues on how to prevent violent extremism and how to prevent especially violence promoting Islamism, on the level of professionals, this already worked during the past governments as well. On the political level, I will not be able to tell you how European cooperation would change, since I still believe that, in the view of many political parties, the Sweden Democrats are still not they are not considered to be quite clean party when it comes to entering the big hall rooms of political debates and political discussions. But this is a reality that obviously not only the European Union but also the countries of the Nordic cooperation will have to face.
And as for my last quick question, if we suppose that this right-wing government comes into fruition, and you've also mentioned the Middle Eastern countries from Islam who try to gain influence by sending preachers, imams to Sweden. Could this be a point of battle between the Islamic influence in the region and the right-wing government?
I'm not sure on the government level, since these issues are mainly something that occur on a different level. On one hand, yes, there could be a political debate. And to mention a concrete example from the general elections that we just talked about, there was a fairly new party in this general election called Nyans in Swedish, which means nuance, the same thing in English, which is a party that is led by a Turkish person who used to be a member of another Swedish party, the Center Party, that used to belong to the right wing, but then eventually started to tend more towards the left side because they really, really wanted to exclude the Sweden Democrats, and they really did not want to cooperate with the Sweden Democrats. And this, the leader of this Nyans party is interesting because he was kicked out of the Center Party because he had alleged connections to the Turkish Grey Wolves, which is the militant youth wing of Turkey's ultranationalist MHP. And the association with the Grey Wolves is not something that is new to this person and the Swedish political landscape as such, because there has been actually a former minister of Turkish origin who was the Minister for Housing Affairs, a member of the Swedish Green Party, who eventually was also kicked out because his alleged membership in this party. So yes, we see that there are certain areas that might turn into larger conflicts, such as, for instance, association with this extremist party in Turkey, and this party being yet again another example of how Erdogan is trying to increase his influence in Europe. But it is less likely that we will see these political debates between either Sweden and the Muslim world in an open agenda, or that we will actually be able to read about what is happening behind the closed doors in the newspaper. Well, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I'm afraid our time is up. So thank you so much for this discussion. And
thank you.
For our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.